People who've escaped a cult, what horrifying secrets did you discover? I was 14 when Father Silas called my name during morning prayer and said I'd been chosen for the harvest, and everyone around me started crying tears of joy while I felt my stomach drop because my brother Matias had been chosen 3 years ago, and I hadn't seen him since he walked through that red door. The harvest ceremony happened every autumn at our compound, where 50 of us children lived in what we called the Garden of Divine Purpose, and every year 3 or 4 teenagers would be selected to transcend their earthly bodies and join the ascended ones in eternal paradise. Or at least that's what Father Silas told us when we'd gather in the main hall and watch our siblings disappear forever. I remember being 7 years old and asking Mother Deborah why the chosen ones never came back to visit, and she slapped me so hard my ear rang for 3 days, saying that questioning God's plan was the first step toward corruption and damnation. We weren't allowed to speak the names of the harvested children after they left, because Father Silas said their earthly identities had been shed like snakeskin, and they existed now as pure light and energy in service to the divine. But sometimes late at night I'd whisper Matthias's name into my pillow and wonder if he could hear me from paradise. The compound sat deep in the forest, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that Father Silas said protected us from the corrupted world beyond, but I'd always wondered why paradise needed fences and locks, and why the gates only opened outward, never inward, and why none of the adults ever seemed to leave even for supplies. 3 other children were chosen with me that year, and I remember their faces going pale when Father Silas called their names during the selection ceremony, because everyone knew being chosen was supposed to be an honor, but none of us looked honored. We looked terrified. Naomi was 15 and had the most beautiful singing voice, and she'd led our evening hymns since she was 10 years old, and when Father Silas placed his hand on her head to bless her, I saw her flinch like she'd been struck. Thomas was 16 and could recite every verse of the sacred texts from memory, and he'd always been Father Silas's favorite during lessons. But now he stared at the red door with this expression like he was looking at his own grave. Little Iris was only 12 years old, and that scared me most because the harvest usually took teenagers. But Father Silas said she had an old soul ready to transcend, and when her name was called, she started crying so hard that Mother Deborah had to carry her out of the hall. We were taken immediately after the ceremony to the purification chambers beneath the main building, and I'd never been down there before because only the chosen ones entered those rooms, and I remember the smell hitting me first, something chemical and metallic that made my eyes water and my throat close up. Mother Deborah separated us into individual cells that were maybe 6 feet by 8 feet with concrete floors and a single cot and a bucket in the corner, and she said we'd spend the next 7 days preparing our vessels for transcendence through fasting and meditation and sacred medicines. The sacred medicines came 3 times a day in the form of white pills that Mother Deborah would watch us swallow, and at first I took them obediently, because I'd never questioned the compound's rules in my entire life, but within an hour of taking that first dose, I felt like I was floating outside my own body. Everything seemed distant and unimportant, and when Mother Deborah came back to measure my arms and legs with a fabric tape, I couldn't even feel confused about why she needed my measurements because the pills made all my questions feel fuzzy and irrelevant. She wrote numbers in a leather journal, muttering under her breath about compatibility and market value and optimal harvest timing, and those words should have terrified me, but they just drifted past my drugged consciousness like leaves on water. On the second day, she brought this machine with her that she pressed against my chest and abdomen, and I could hear beeping sounds and see green lines on a small screen, and she'd nod to herself and make more notes in her journal. The fasting was brutal even through the medication fog, and by day 3 my stomach felt like it was eating itself, and I could hear Naomi crying through the wall, and Thomas shouting something I couldn't make out, and Iris screaming for her mother who died when she was 6. Mother Deborah would come check on us every few hours and give us sips of water and more pills, and she'd stroke my hair like I was a pet being groomed for show, and tell me I was so lucky to have been chosen for this sacred purpose. On day 4, something in me snapped awake through the medication haze, and I started pretending to swallow the pills, but actually holding them under my tongue until Mother Deborah left, and then spitting them into cracks in the concrete floor. The fog started lifting gradually, and with clarity came absolute terror, because I could finally process what Mother Deborah had been saying about compatibility, and harvest timing, and market value, and those weren't words you used for sending someone to paradise. I pressed my ear against the wall trying to hear what was happening in the other chambers, and through the concrete I could hear Naomi praying in this desperate whisper, asking God why he wanted her to die so young, and that word die echoed in my skull because we weren't supposed to die, we were supposed to transcend. Thomas was silent in his cell, which scared me more than screaming would have, and sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the corridor outside, and voices discussing lab results and tissue typing and surgical schedules. On day 5, Mother Deborah brought me actual food for the first time, a piece of bread with butter on it, and she watched me eat it with this expression that looked almost like grief, though she tried to hide it, and when I asked her why she was being nice, she said I needed my strength for the journey ahead. Her hand shook when she gave me the evening pills, and I pretended to swallow them while watching her face, and I saw something there that looked like guilt, or maybe regret, but then she blinked, and her expression went cold and professional again. Day 6 was when I heard the screaming coming from somewhere deeper in the facility, screams that sounded nothing like transcendence or paradise, but exactly like someone being hurt very badly, and I banged on my door until my fists bled, but no one came. The screaming went on for what felt like hours, and then stopped abruptly in a way that made my blood run cold, and later that evening Mother Deborah came to my cell with red stains on her white sleeves that she tried to hide by folding her arms. She looked exhausted, And when I asked her what had happened, she said one of the previous harvest children had experienced complications during a secondary procedure, but that I shouldn't worry because I was young and healthy and my success rate was projected at 73%. Success rate for what I asked, but she just gave me more pills that I pretended to swallow and told me to rest because tomorrow was preparation day and I'd need to be strong. That night, I couldn't sleep because my mind was finally clear enough to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with everything I'd been taught my entire life. And I thought about Matias walking through that red door 3 years ago and wondered if he'd screamed like that and whether anyone had heard him. Through my small window, I could see other cells across the corridor, and in one of them I saw movement and pressed my face against the glass and saw someone looking back at me. And even in the dim light, I recognized those eyes because they were Matias's eyes and he was alive. But he looked wrong somehow, like parts of him were missing. Morning of day 7 arrived, and Mother Deborah came to dress me in the white ceremonial robe that smelled like bleach and something else. Something that reminded me of the metallic smell in the preparation chambers, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking even though I was trying to appear calm and compliant. She braided my hair with white ribbons, and I watched her face in the small mirror on the wall and saw her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been counting. And when she finished, she just stood there for a moment with her hands on my shoulders. "You're a good girl," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry about this, but some children are born for harvest, and that's just God's plan." And I wanted to scream at her that this wasn't God's plan. This was something evil disguised as religion. But I kept my mouth shut because I needed to stay calm long enough to figure out what was really happening beyond that red door. They led all 4 of us to the main hall where the entire compound had gathered, and Father Silas stood before the red door in his ceremonial robes that were embroidered with symbols I'd never learned to read, and the other children were singing those haunting harvest hymns we'd practiced since we were small. Thomas had a fresh bruise on his face and wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, and Iris was completely limp like a rag doll in Mother Deborah's arms, and Naomi was just staring at the red door with this empty expression that scared me more than crying would have. Father Silas began his sermon about sacrifice and divine purpose, and how we 4 had been selected from among all the children to serve the highest calling. And I watched his face as he spoke, and saw something there that wasn't holy at all, but was cold and calculating like he was appraising livestock. He talked about the Garden of Paradise waiting beyond the red door, and how the ascended ones lived in eternal bliss free from the corruption of flesh, and as he spoke I noticed details I'd never seen before, like how his ceremonial robes were expensive silk, not the simple cotton we children wore, and how he had a gold watch on his wrist that probably cost more than everything in the compound combined. My feet moved forward when Mother Deborah pushed me toward the aisle, and I walked past my brothers and sisters who were singing about gardens and harvest and eternal peace, and I saw their faces full of genuine belief and love, and I realized they had no idea what was really happening because the pills and the isolation and the constant indoctrination had made them blind to the truth. As I got closer to the red door, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There were scratches around the door handle, deep gouges in the wood like someone had clawed at it desperately trying to get out, and there were dark stains on the threshold that looked suspiciously like old blood that had been scrubbed but not completely removed. Father Silas opened the red door, and the smell that hit me was nothing like incense and flowers, but instead pure chemical antiseptic, mixed with something rotten and wrong. And I saw Thomas gag beside me, and Naomi actually stopped walking completely, until Mother Deborah shoved her forward hard enough that she stumbled. He gestured for us to enter and whispered blessings that sounded more like threats, and as I crossed the threshold, he leaned close and said my sacrifice would fund the compound's mission for another year, and that word sacrifice echoed in my head with its true meaning, not spiritual sacrifice, but physical permanent sacrifice. The door slammed behind us with a heavy metallic click, and instead of the stairway to paradise, I'd imagined we were standing at the top of concrete stairs leading down into fluorescent-lit darkness, and the chemical smell was so strong it burned my nose and throat. Thomas turned to look back at the door, and I saw his face go white because there was no handle on this side, just smooth metal, and Naomi started crying in these quiet, hiccuping sobs that she tried to muffle, and Iris was completely unconscious in Mother Deborah's arms. We had no choice but to go down the stairs, and with each step the air got colder, and the smell got stronger, and I could hear machinery humming and beeping sounds like medical equipment and voices discussing procedures and recovery times. At the bottom of the stairs, the corridor opened into what looked like a hospital hallway, with white tile walls and fluorescent lights, and steel doors with small windows, and through those windows I could see them, and I felt my legs give out. My brothers and sisters who'd been harvested in previous years, except they weren't in paradise. They were in cells behind locked doors, and some of them were missing limbs, and others had long surgical scars across their bodies, and one girl I recognized as Leah, who'd been chosen 2 years ago, was hooked up to machines through tubes in her arms and chest. Mother Deborah walked ahead of us like this was completely normal, and she started explaining in this clinical voice that the harvest wasn't a spiritual ceremony, but a medical procedure where they removed organs from us children and sold them to wealthy patients who paid enormous sums for young, healthy transplant tissue. She said it so matter-of-factly like she was explaining how to do laundry, and I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up completely. Thomas threw up on the pristine white floor, and Mother Deborah slapped him hard across the face and told him to show some dignity, and remember this was a holy calling that would save the lives of true believers, even if technically speaking it also made Father Silas extremely wealthy in the process. She led us past cell after cell, and I saw children I'd grown up with, children I'd shared meals and chores and prayers with, and they were all alive but wrong, diminished, missing pieces of themselves, both literally and figuratively. In the third cell on the left I saw him, and the scream that came out of me didn't even sound human because Matias was there behind that locked door, and he was missing his left arm completely, and had a massive scar down his chest, and when he saw me, his eyes went wide with horror, and he started throwing himself against the door, screaming my name and screaming, "Run," and screaming, "They'll take everything until there's nothing left." Mother Deborah pulled me away from his cell and said he'd been an excellent donor, very compatible tissue type, and they'd harvested one kidney and partial liver and one lung, and his left arm had developed an infection after a bone marrow extraction, so they'd had to amputate, and he was scheduled for his final harvest next month, where they'd take whatever was left and then dispose of the remains. She said this like she was reading from a shopping list while my brother screamed, and I could see other children in their cells reacting to his screams, starting to shout and bang on their doors, and the whole facility erupted into chaos. Naomi had collapsed completely and was being dragged by her arm, and Thomas was backing away slowly like he was trying to find an escape route, and Iris had woken up and was staring at everything with these huge, terrified eyes. Mother Deborah took me to a preparation room that was set up like an operating theater with steel tables and bright lights and surgical instruments laid out in neat rows, and she started explaining the procedure in that same clinical tone, saying they'd take one kidney first, and part of my liver since those organs regenerate, and then depending on my recovery, they'd harvest more in stages over the next few years. She said about 60% of children survived the first surgery, and those who did became permanent donors kept alive in the cells to provide ongoing tissue and blood and bone marrow as needed. And I thought about Matias living in that cell for 3 years, having pieces of himself removed one by one until there was nothing left to take. The wealthy patients who bought the organs were told they were receiving divinely blessed transplants from willing young believers who considered organ donation their spiritual calling, and they paid prices that made Father Silas a very rich man and funded this entire underground facility. She showed me consent forms with forged signatures and medical records that had been falsified and explained how they'd been running this operation for over 20 years, using foster children and runaways and kids whose parents had sold them for money, and no one ever came looking because we didn't officially exist in any government database. Father Silas had connections with corrupt social workers and judges who provided him with children, and in return he'd give them a cut of the profits, and everyone was happy, except the children being slowly carved up in the name of God. Something in me that had been obedient and compliant my entire life finally snapped, and when Mother Deborah turned her back to prepare the anesthesia, I grabbed the nearest surgical tray and swung it at her head with every ounce of strength I possessed. The sound it made when metal connected with skull was sickening, but she dropped like a stone and blood pooled around her head on that pristine white floor, and I didn't wait to see if she was breathing. I just grabbed the keyring from her belt and ran. I unlocked Matias's cell first, and he stumbled out on unsteady legs, his remaining arm reaching for me, and when we hugged I could feel how much weight he'd lost, how his ribs pressed against my chest, and he was crying, saying I shouldn't be here, saying they'd take me apart piece by piece like they did to him. I told him we were leaving, all of us, and I started unlocking every cell in that corridor, and children poured out, some of them barely able to walk, and others who'd been there so long they'd forgotten what the sun looked like. There were maybe 20 children total in various states of harvest, some missing kidneys, some missing parts of their livers, some with only one lung, and all of them scarred and broken and furious, now that someone had finally opened their cages. Matias knew the facility layout from his 3 years of captivity, and he led half the children toward a service tunnel he'd discovered during his time in the cells, while the rest of us created a distraction by rushing the stairs back toward the main hall. We could hear Father Silas's voice calling down, asking what was taking so long and whether Mother Deborah needed assistance with the difficult ones, and when he appeared at the top of the stairs and saw his children covered in blood and rage, his face went pale. He tried to close the door, but Thomas hit it with his shoulder, and we all pushed through into the main hall where the other children were still gathered, and when they saw us, their singing stopped abruptly. I screamed that Father Silas was a liar and a murderer, and the harvest wasn't spiritual transcendence but organ trafficking, and I showed them my brother missing his arm, and the other children with their surgical scars. And for a moment there was absolute silence. Then one of the younger children asked if the ascended ones were real, and I said no, they're not real. They're dead or locked in cells being carved up for money, and you could see belief shattering across 40 faces as everything they'd been taught, their entire lives revealed itself as a lie designed to make them complicit in their own exploitation. Father Silas tried to salvage the situation by saying I was corrupted by demons and spreading lies. But then Matias spoke up and described in detail what they'd taken from him, and how many other children he'd watched die in those cells, and his voice had this dead quality that was more convincing than any passionate speech could have been. The other children from the compound started backing away from Father Silas, and some of the older boys actually moved toward him with fists clenched, and he realized he was losing control of the situation he'd maintained for 2 decades through lies and drugs and isolation. He ran for the red door, trying to lock it from the other side, but the children from the cells who'd rushed the stairs were already climbing through, and they were angry in ways that children who'd been drugged couldn't be, because they'd been conscious and aware during their harvests. They'd felt every cut, even if they couldn't resist. Father Silas made it to his office and locked the door, and I could hear him on the phone calling for security or backup or whoever helped him run this nightmare operation, but Matias said we didn't have much time before more adults arrived, so we needed to leave now. I grabbed Iris and Naomi and Thomas and told them to follow me. And Matias led us to the service tunnel. He'd mentioned, a narrow concrete passage that ran under the compound's perimeter fence and connected to an old drainage system. Some of the children from the cells were too weak to run, and some were still in shock, but about 15 of us made it into the tunnel before we heard shouting and footsteps behind us. We crawled through darkness for what felt like hours, my hands bleeding from rough concrete and Iris whimpering on my back, and behind us I could hear Father Silas's voice echoing through the tunnel system shouting that we couldn't survive in the corrupted world, that we'd be lost without his guidance. But I'd rather be lost and free than found and harvested. So I kept crawling until finally we emerged through a rusted drainage grate into the forest beyond the compound walls, and I saw the sky for the first time in 7 days, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed, even though we were all bleeding and terrified and had no idea what to do next. We ran through the forest in our white ceremonial robes that got torn and muddy, and some of the younger children kept falling, but we'd pick them up and keep going because stopping meant death, and none of us were ready to die, not after we'd fought so hard to escape. We walked for 2 days following a creek because water had to lead somewhere, and we ate berries and drank from the stream. And at night, we huddled together for warmth, and some children cried, and others just stared into the darkness with empty eyes. Matias was getting weaker, and I knew his body was struggling without the medications they'd been giving him to prevent organ rejection of the partial transplants he'd received from other donors, and I prayed to a God I no longer believed in that he'd survive long enough to see real freedom. On the second day, we found a road, an actual paved road with yellow lines and a sign that said, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 8,341, and I fell to my knees and sobbed because there were 8,341 people who existed outside Father Silas's compound, who lived normal lives, who weren't being prepared for organ harvest. A car stopped when the driver saw us 15 children in torn white robes covered in mud and blood and bruises, and the woman behind the wheel went pale and grabbed her phone, and within minutes, police cars and ambulances filled the road. The officers wrapped us in blankets and tried to ask questions, but most of us couldn't speak coherently. We just kept repeating fragments about the harvest and the red door and the cells and the organs, and they must have thought we were crazy until one officer examined Matias and saw his missing arm and surgical scars, and his expression changed from skeptical to horrified. They took us to Millbrook Hospital, and I remember the emergency room erupting into controlled chaos as doctors realized they were treating children who'd undergone multiple organ harvesting procedures without proper medical care. Detective Wallace interviewed me in my hospital room, and I told him everything about the compound and Father Silas and the 20 years of trafficking children for their organs, and he listened with his jaw getting tighter and tighter, and when I finished, he made one phone call that brought the FBI and state police and every news outlet within 200 miles to our small town. They raided the compound that same evening, and what they found made national headlines for months because it wasn't just organ trafficking, it was systematic exploitation of vulnerable children on a scale that shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. They found 43 children in various states of surgical recovery locked in those underground cells, and evidence of over 200 children who'd passed through the facility in the past 2 decades, most of whom had died during procedures or from post-surgical complications. They found financial records showing Father Silas had made over $30 million selling organs to wealthy patients who asked no questions about where young, healthy transplant tissue came from, and they found a network of corrupt doctors and social workers and judges who'd helped him maintain the operation for 2 decades. Father Silas tried to run when he saw the police coming, but they caught him at the compound's gate, and the footage of him being handcuffed while screaming about religious persecution became the most viral video of that year. Mother Deborah survived her head injury but had permanent brain damage and spent the trial drooling and unable to remember why she'd spent 15 years preparing children to have their organs removed, and the prosecutor said that was probably a mercy. The trial took 3 years because the case was so complex with so many victims and so many defendants, and I testified for 4 days straight describing everything I'd seen and experienced, and the jury looked physically ill by the time I finished. Matias testified from a wheelchair because his body never recovered from the multiple harvest procedures, and halfway through his testimony, 3 jurors started crying and had to be excused and replaced with alternates. The defense tried to argue that Father Silas genuinely believed he was serving a higher purpose, and that the children had been willing participants in a religious calling, but that argument fell apart when they played recordings of children screaming during procedures, and when they showed photos of the cells and the surgical instruments and the financial records proving this was about money, not faith. Father Silas got 12 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, and the judge said he was a monster who'd hidden behind religion to justify crimes against children that defied human understanding, and when they let him away in chains, he was still insisting he'd saved lives by providing organs to people who needed them, as if that somehow justified killing and torturing children. I lived with the Harpers after the trial, a foster family who were patient and kind, and gave me space to heal at my own pace. And Mrs. Harper taught me what real religion looked like, faith that uplifted instead of exploited, and Mr. Harper helped me understand that not all father figures use their power to hurt people. Matias lived with a medical foster family because he needed constant care, but we video chatted every week, and slowly he started to believe he might have a future beyond being a donor. Some of the other survivors weren't as lucky. Iris never mentally recovered and lives in a psychiatric facility where she draws pictures of the red door and the cells, and Thomas moved across the country and changed his name and told me he never wanted to think about the compound again as long as he lived. Detective Wallace stayed in touch and would send me news clippings when other religious compounds got shut down for similar crimes, and he'd always write the same thing at the bottom of the message: another monster caught because you were brave enough to speak up, and I'd cry every time because being brave shouldn't have been necessary. Children should have been protected long before it came to us saving ourselves. The compound was demolished and turned into a memorial garden where 200 trees were planted, one for each child who'd passed through Father Silas's harvest operation. And on the anniversary of our escape, I go there with the other survivors who can bear to remember, and we stand among those trees and we whisper the names of the ones who didn't make it out. Sometimes I still wake up smelling chemicals and feeling hands measuring my arms and legs, and I have to remind myself that I'm 32 years old now, living in my own apartment with a job and friends and a life that Father Silas tried to steal from me, but didn't succeed. The scars on my arms from where Mother Deborah marked me for harvest have faded, but they're still visible if you know where to look, and sometimes strangers ask about them, and I tell them the truth because silence is what allows monsters like Father Silas to operate for 20 years without being caught. We weren't sent to paradise, we were being prepared for slaughter, and the only transcendence that happened was when we transcended our fear long enough to run toward freedom instead of accepting the lies we'd been fed our entire lives, and that's the real miracle. Not divine intervention, but human courage in the face of absolute horror. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.